It's been called a sanctuary of Christian mysticism, a living fortress of ancient spirituality, and Europe's most sacred time capsule. On a secluded island in the Aegean Sea is the hidden heartland of Orthodox Christians. It's a place where the old imperial culture of the Eastern Romans, the Byzantines, still survives. This medieval monastic country is entirely self-governed by the leadership of its 20 monasteries. Together they govern Mount Athos in northern Greece, an autonomous republic complete with its own flag, time zone, and borders of which no woman has crossed in over 1,000 years. On the holy slopes of Athos dwell many revered monks, ascetics, and hermits whose entire lives are devoted to prayer. They are Christian sages living completely separated from the modern world. The spiritual exploits of the monks of Athos, the mystery of its ancient monasteries, and its ecumenical significance make it the center of Orthodoxy, a place to silently pursue God. Mount Athos was originally thought by the Greeks to be the site of a great battle between the gods and giants of their old mythology. A giant named Athos hurled a boulder at Poseidon, which landed in the sea. Today, this boulder stands as prominent Mount Athos on the peninsula called by the same name. Its geographical significance was reinforced by the Persian Emperor Xerxes in the 5th century BC, who, after losing his fleet in a storm off of Athos, dug a canal over 1 mile long, separating it from the mainland. Throughout Greek and Roman rule, Athos was not known to hold any spiritual significance. However, Eastern Orthodox traditions report that Mary, the mother of Jesus, with St. John were blown off course while on a journey to visit Lazarus in Cyprus. Having been waylaid on Athos, Mary was overtaken by the beauty of the island and asked her son, Jesus the Christ, that it be given to her as her personal garden. Today, these traditions are upheld by the name of the island, which is the Garden of the Holy Virgin Mary. Since this dedication to Mary, no other female aside from Mary herself has ever been permitted to set foot on the island. The years before and after Jesus walked the earth were known as a period of stability in the ancient world. The Roman Empire had installed international peace for a period of around 200 years known as the Pax Romana. From around 27 BC to 180 AD, Roman culture prevailed over the Mediterranean and in much of Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. In many ways, the Pax Romana allowed early Christians who had followed Jesus of Nazareth many advantages when spreading the good news of his resurrection. Lack of war, access to road systems, trade routes, and common use of Greek or Latin languages all allowed for the rapid spread of the early church. The news of Christ's resurrection had soon spread from Roman Palestine to Egypt, Syria, Italy, and Greece. These 5 lands would come to be the seat of the Pentarchy, or the Rule of 5. They housed in their major cities the most important centers of Christian leadership in the early church. The cities of Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Rome, and Constantinople were the seat of the bishops and maintained communion together despite various doctrinal contests known later as ecumenical councils. Some expressions of the early church were exceptionally radical to the point of inspiring Christian believers from around the world. One of these paradigms, which heavily influenced the development of Mount Athos, was the practice of asceticism by the Desert Fathers. The Desert Fathers, led by Anthony the Great, were the first major example of Christian asceticism, the practice of self-denial to grow closer to God. Anthony himself was reported to be from a well-off family in Middle Egypt, but after being orphaned, he entered the church and was inspired by the verse of scripture in Matthew 19:21, where Jesus commands one of his followers seeking eternal life, quote, "If you want to be perfect, go sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me." The Desert Fathers emphasized prayer, solitude, and poverty, all through spiritual disciplines of asceticism. They were hardworking, but only allowed a small number of handcrafted goods to be sold to patrons who took pilgrimage to their collective housing. Some monks took more extreme forms of practice and lived in total isolation, with their lives dedicated entirely to prayer. Others lived a communal existence, but for the most part, the life of the hermit, as practiced by St. Anthony and his followers in Lower Egypt, was the prevailing inheritance of the Desert Fathers in later eras. This tradition would be revived several times over in the Orthodox Church, beginning not least with Mount Athos itself. Starting with the Desert Fathers, asceticism revolutionized Christian worship from Anthony the Great in the 3rd century AD and eventually made its way to the halls of the monasteries in Athos. Christian ascetics are reported to have been sporadically present on Athos between the 3rd and 8th century AD, but it is not until 843 that definitive reports of ascetic monks from Bithynian Olympus, Ida, and Athos took part in the ecumenical council of the same year. This suggests not only a formally established tradition, but also a rising significance of Athos as a spiritual center within Christian orthodoxy. By this time, there were traditions of Christian mysticism and hermitages all throughout Turkey, Syria, and other areas in the East which had been set apart for the worship of God through thoughtful prayer and simple living. In the wake of political turmoil such as the Byzantine Wars against the rising power of the Seljuk Turks, some of these holy places were destroyed. The refugees from these monasteries sought shelter in more secure locations, particularly within the Byzantine-controlled areas of Turkey and Greece. This made Athos an attractive and central hermitage. The proximity to Constantinople, one of the 5 main patriarchates of Orthodoxy, added to this appeal. Monasticism had been spread over the whole island by the 9th century by the order of Basil I, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. However, their living conditions were poor, with many monks living in improvised huts, eating from the wild trees, and falling victim to pirate raids. The man who changed Athos from a collection of huts and hermits to a pan-Orthodox stronghold of monasticism was named Saint Athanasius the Athonite. He came from the city of Trebizond in eastern Turkey and had migrated westward as a monk in the early 10th century. During his project to build the monastery of Lavra, the largest on Athos, Athanasius was initially resisted by the hermits already living there. They did not want their privacy disturbed by newcomers, preferred more collective monastic settlement. However, upon receiving a chrysobull, or gold seal from the emperor, Athanasius was encouraged to continue his construction of what would become the oldest monastery on Mount Athos in 963 AD. By his death in the year 1000, he had finished the building complex at Lavra Monastery and laid the foundation for communal monasticism, which would shape the island in the coming centuries. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Byzantine emperors, along with the patriarchs of Constantinople, continued to write privileges and honors for the Athos priesthood, which attracted monks from around the Orthodox world. Many began to seek out Athos as their spiritual and physical home. It thus became an epicenter of pan-Orthodoxy, with ethnic Romanian, Russian, Greek, Serbian, Bulgarian, and Moldovan priests living there. Though safe from the raids of the Seljuk Turks in the east, they were subject to piracy at times, and eventually the Latin Catholic armies of the west. During the Fourth Crusade, Latin armies had taken the city of Constantinople and inflicted great financial burdens on the Athonite monks after settling nearby. In the 14th century, the raiding of the Catalan Grand Company, a powerful band of mercenaries from Catalonia, had reduced the number of monasteries on the island from over 300 to 35 by the end of the century. There was some recovery during the reign of Macedonian and Serbian rulers, who supported the monastery and made financial commitments to ensure its long-term success and survival. It was also during this period that a movement swept through Orthodoxy, embracing hesychasm, a mystical tradition of contemplative prayer and inner stillness. It called back to the lives of the Desert Fathers and re-inspired many Orthodox priests to once again take up ascetic disciplines in their monastic life. Though popular in religious circles, broader Byzantine society was utterly divided on the issue of hesychasm. Mount Athos had become a hub for the hesychast movement, and in doing so separated itself from the Byzantine society both theologically and communally. Despite many unsuccessful attempts by the emperor to combat its spread, hesychasm would grow throughout the empire's spiritual community and thus cast more attention on Athos as a kind of new desert, once again referring to the Desert Fathers. One archbishop of Thessalonica and former monk of Athos, Gregory Palamas, in his hagiography presents Mount Athos as exactly that, a kind of spiritual desert, ideal for the practice of asceticism. His use of desert imagery in describing Athos showed it as a place of silence, angelic living, and divine encounter, much like the early monastic deserts in Egypt. Though a revival of monastic zeal came out of the hesychast movement, it would not be long before a new threat would emerge from the east. The Ottoman Turks had been at war with the Byzantines for many years. The rising pressure of their encroachment was pushing Athos closer and closer to the borders of Christendom and the rising tide of Islam. In 1354, the town Gallipoli fell to the Ottomans, who then established their first foothold in Europe. This was the beginning of the end for Byzantium, and within the coming century, the Turks would take Constantinople itself, marking the end of the era of the Second Rome. Through clever maneuvering and crippling financial payouts, the monastic communities on Athos survived the rule of the Turks, partly due to their isolation. Since the holy city of their faith in Constantinople was now ruled by Muslims, and their main church, the Hagia Sophia, was now a mosque, Athos was uniquely positioned as a preservation of what used to inspire all of Eastern Christendom. Their persistent resistance to Turkish efforts at the seizure of their land provided them with a degree of religious autonomy. Their payouts at times placed monasteries in debt to the Ottomans. These payments were covered by the rulers of Russia, Wallachia, and Moldavia, the Orthodox lands to the north. This support of Athos created strong ties and continues to this day among lands adjacent to Greece. In fact, in the 18th century, the Kolyvads movement revived hesychasm and emphasized the theology of the Desert Fathers alongside traditional monasticism once again. By the time the Greeks took control in the year 1912, Athos had been able to function more or less under the rule of the Turks without having been significantly damaged or altered. The First Balkan War had allowed the Greeks to make a mostly peaceful acquisition of the island, and it was granted a special status as an autonomous republic within Greece. This period of newfound liberty was unfortunately interrupted in the 20th century, most notably by the Nazis in their occupation of Greece. Seeing no way to effectively deter Hitler, the monks of Athos offered him a title as the protector of the island in exchange for them being left alone. Hitler accepted, and in his preoccupation was never able to collect the treasures of Athos which he had initially desired. Today, Mount Athos stands at a crossroads. While it has cautiously embraced elements of modernity such as electricity, automobiles, and limited technology, many monks view these changes with a concern. They fear the loss of the simplicity and the spiritual focus that have defined the peninsula for over 1,000 years. Despite these changes, life on Athos remains deeply rooted in its medieval traditions and Orthodox asceticism. For the few fortunate visitors allowed each day, setting foot on Mount Athos feels like stepping into another era, a place untouched by time, where the silence speaks louder than words and spiritual discipline shapes every moment. Its future may be uncertain, but the legacy of the Desert Fathers endures there, etched into the stones, prayers, and way of life that continue to define this sacred island.